A 9-year-old girl vanished from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. Days later, deputies would climb 20 feet into a hole in the ground and find something no parent should ever have to hear about. But the most disturbing part of this case isn't where they found her. It's who had been lying to investigators the entire time. In the tiny town of Stella, Missouri, population under 200, everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew Rowan Ford. She was 9 years old, in the 4th grade, and by every account the kind of kid who made a room brighter just by walking into it. She loved to read, loved to draw, loved riding her bike around the neighborhood. She was up before sunrise most mornings to help set up for church, always sitting on the steps with a smile when the pastor arrived. Her teachers adored her. One of them later said she was just a little ray of sunshine, the sweetest girl you would ever meet. But Rowan's home life wasn't as sunny. She often came to school with tangled, unbrushed hair. Sometimes she didn't have socks on, even in the freezing Missouri winter. She was the youngest of 5, shy around strangers, the kind of kid who'd hide behind her older sister until she trusted you. And then, her sister said, it's like the whole room lit up. She lived with her mother, Collings, and her stepfather, David Spears. Collings worked nights at Walmart, and every single shift, Rowan would be waiting in the driveway when she got home, bursting to hear how her day went. On the night of November 2nd, 2007, that didn't happen. Collings came home, and the driveway was empty. She checked Rowan's room. Empty, she asked David, who'd been asleep on the couch, where their daughter was. He said she was at a friend's house. He didn't say which friend. And here's where it gets unsettling. Collings wanted to call the police right away. David told her not to. For hours, they just waited for a phone call that never came. It wasn't until 6:50 that evening, nearly a full day after Rowan had actually gone missing, that she was finally reported. An Amber Alert went out. The town of Stella turned out in force. Dozens of officers, 50 specialists, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and eventually the FBI descended on this town of 200 people to search for one little girl. And almost immediately, investigators zeroed in on one glaring problem. David's story kept changing. First, he said he'd gone out with 2 friends, Christopher and Nathan, and come home around midnight without checking on Rowan. Then that story shifted. Now he'd gone out again around 1:30 in the morning, borrowed his mother's SUV, and still never checked on his stepdaughter. He waited 8 to 10 hours to report her missing. The county sheriff would later call that extremely strange. David, he said, had been caught in lie after lie. So investigators turned to the other 2 men who'd been with him that night. Nathan's story. The 3 of them, David, Nathan, and a man named Christopher Collings, had been drinking, playing pool, smoking marijuana. At some point, Nathan drove Christopher home, and David came along, leaving Rowan alone at the house. Nathan eventually dropped David off and was home by midnight. Christopher told nearly the same story, except he conveniently left out the marijuana and claimed he'd gone straight to sleep in his trailer, with no idea Rowan was even missing. Here's the thing about Christopher Collings. He wasn't a stranger to this family. He and David had been close friends for years. He'd actually lived with them for a few months, sleeping in their basement, helping Rowan with her homework. She called him Uncle Chris. At first, Christopher looked like the model witness, cooperative, concerned. He even showed up at Collings' house to check on the search. He agreed to a polygraph. He agreed to a voice stress test. He offered to wear a wire. He gave the FBI ideas on where to search. But the local police chief, a man named Clinton Clark, who'd known Christopher for 17 years, started noticing something was off. Christopher wouldn't meet his eyes anymore. He seemed nervous, kind of excited, Clark would later say, in a way that didn't sit right. And here's where I need you to stick with me, because the next 48 hours of this case are going to flip everything you think you know about who is responsible. If you're finding this one as gripping as I am, hit follow now, because what David Spears' own boss discovered by simply driving around with him is what cracked this entire case wide open, and you don't want to miss it. David's own boss, the county coroner, a former sheriff named Mark Bridges, spent a day driving around with David, wired up for the FBI, a surveillance plane circling overhead. Bridges tried a psychological trick. He asked David to play devil's advocate. If Christopher was involved, where would he have put the body David thought about it for a minute. Then he said, "Let's go look." The first place he drove to was a hole in the ground in the woods, roughly 30 feet off the road. Fox Cave. 2 days later, on November 9th. Deputies rappelled 20 feet down into that sinkhole, and on a ledge in the dark, they found Rowan's body. The autopsy confirmed the worst. She had been raped. She had died from strangulation. Her body showed cuts, bruising, and facial trauma consistent with being thrown into the hole. The same day her body was found, Christopher called Chief Clark, frantic, convinced he was being followed by a gray minivan. Clark met him and told him gently, "Well, son, it's over. We found Rowan's body this morning." Christopher's head dropped. His eyes filled with tears. They drove to a quiet bridge outside of town, away from the crowd at the station. Christopher put his wrists out, ready to be handcuffed. He was told that wasn't necessary yet. His reply, "For what I'm about to tell you, you will." And then he told them everything. He said that after David and Nathan left his trailer that night, he knew he could beat them back to the house if he cut through on the highway instead of the back roads. He drove to Rowan's home, went inside, and carried her, still asleep, out to his truck. He didn't speak, he said, so she wouldn't recognize his voice. But at some point, she woke up. She looked over her shoulder, and she recognized him, the man who helped her with homework, the man she called Uncle Chris. He said he freaked out. There was rope in the truck. He used it to strangle her. He said he'd originally planned to dump her body off a nearby bridge, but worried she'd be found too quickly. So he drove around until he landed on Fox Cave, threw her in, and tried, uselessly, to cover the opening with branches. Then he went home, found blood on his clothes and his mattress, and burned the evidence in a wood stove. It was, in the words of investigators, one of the most disturbing confessions they'd ever heard. But this case wasn't done throwing curveballs, because when police went back to confront David Spears with what Christopher had said, David also confessed. He claimed he'd arrived, found Christopher already assaulting Rowan, joined in the assault himself, and then strangled her with the rope Christopher had handed him. 2 men, 2 confessions, each one blaming himself, and denying the other had anything to do with it. Both men were charged with statutory rape, forcible rape, and first-degree murder, both held without bond. And the town of Stella, population 200, tried to bury a 9-year-old girl, while still not knowing which of the 2 men who confessed was actually telling the truth. More than 300 people came to Rowan's funeral. Her classmates released balloons with notes attached. A pink dogwood tree was planted at her school in her memory. Her mother, Collings, filed for divorce from David before the case even went to trial. Then, years later, came a twist almost nobody saw coming. New forensic testing from an independent lab came back, and it didn't match David's confession at all. The physical evidence lined up with Christopher's account, not David's. Inconsistencies piled up in David's story about strangling Rowan. After nearly 5 years of pursuing the case, the prosecutor made the call. The rape and murder charges against David Spears were dropped entirely. Instead, David pleaded to hindering prosecution and endangering the welfare of a child. The maximum sentence allowed for each, adding up to 11 years. He would ultimately serve just over 7 before being released in 2015, which left one question hanging over the entire case, one that a local sheriff would later say is no good answer. Why would man confess, in vivid detail, to strangling a child he didn't kill? Christopher Collings stood trial alone. His defense argued severe childhood neglect and trauma had left him with a diagnosed dissociative attachment disorder, that he'd never intended to kill Rowan, that things had spiraled in a moment of panic. The jury wasn't moved. On March 20th, they convicted him of first-degree murder. In the penalty phase, they recommended death. What followed was over a decade of appeals, all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court, all the way to a request for clemency from the governor, all denied. On December 3rd, 2024, 17 years after Rowan vanished from her bedroom, Christopher Collings was executed by lethal injection. He left behind a written statement. Right or wrong, I accept the situation for what it is. To anyone that I have hurt in this life, I am sorry. The sheriff who worked the case for nearly 2 decades still carries Rowan's school ID card in his pocket. He said the case changed the way his department handles every report involving a child. "We hate taking children from homes," he said. "But if there's any question at all, we do it. We always think back on this." Rowan's teacher couldn't bring himself to clear out her desk for weeks. Her best friend's mother said her own son still can't sleep alone, still talks about Rowan all these years later. And her older sister put it simply, "A part of me died when my sister died." Rowan Ford was 9 years old. She loved Barbie, loved church, loved her bike, and in a town of 200 people, she was loved by every single one of them.